Hey everyone. So, about 2 weeks ago, I gave my presentation on women's hockey analytics at RITSAC 2018. That's the Rochester Institute of Technology Sports Analytics Conference. And since then, there's already been some kind of exciting developments in the world of women's hockey analytics, but I thought I would put the presentation, particularly the slideshow, up on the Ice Garden and on our YouTube channel. So those of you who are curious about what my presentation was about, or if you didn't get to catch it, or if you didn't see it well enough on the stream of RITSAC, this is just a different way for you to see what my talk was about. And I guess I'll just try and do my best to recreate my presentation for you here. So 3 years ago, I started covering women's hockey, and I should preface that by saying professional women's hockey. I had been interested in women's hockey like a lot of people, particularly at the Sochi Games, but once the Olympics were over, I live in New Jersey, there wasn't really an opportunity to watch a lot of collegiate women's hockey, and the nearest CWHL team was in Boston, so it didn't really lend itself to something I could get into. But when the New York Riveters came into existence with the NWHL in 2015, it presented a really unique opportunity for me to kind of challenge myself to do something different, instead of just writing about the Rangers all the time, which is what I had been doing over at Blue Shirt Banter on SB Nation. And so I began covering the Riveters for Blue Shirt Banter, and in short order I found myself recruited to write about the Riveters at Today's Slapshot. And while I was trying to really adapt and learn the women's game, because it is different, but it's not different in the sense that it's lesser, but we'll get into that in a bit. But it quickly became apparent to me that there are not enough reliable statistics out there, especially for the professional leagues. There's a lot of really insightful and enlightening data for women's NCAA college hockey, but trying to understand what something like the jump from the college game to the pro game in that first year for me was really difficult. And so I started to track primary counting stats, or I started to track primary points, I should say, and I broke it down by strength. And over the past 3 years, I've done that for the NWHL and CWHL skaters. And I'm slowly but surely building a database of, these very simple events in terms of hockey analytics. Just primary points are not that hard to track. It means you have to go through box scores and identify, the scoring events and break things down the best that you can and mark when events happen at what strength. But even having something like this, it just wasn't there before. I couldn't find it. No one could find it when I was trying to reach out to people. And so starting with this kind of opened a lot of doors for me, and it got me in touch with a lot of people who are also interested in women's hockey analytics and trying to bring professional women's hockey statistics to the next level. And that's kind of where I am now. But before we get into the nitty-gritty, we're going to talk about some myths and misconceptions, because we kind of unfortunately have to get them out of the way. And there's three major myths or misconceptions that I deal with all the time, and the other writers at the Ice Garden know them all too well. And I'm sure many of fans and other members of the media know them very well too. The first major myth or misconception is that no one cares. We hear this a lot, particularly on social media, or when there's a big development in women's hockey. It's a very trollish comment, but of course it's ignorant. There are more fans in women's hockey than ever before. The audiences are getting bigger and bigger. The gold medal game of the 2018 Olympics on NBCSN had 2.9 million viewers, and that was a game that started at 11 p.m. Eastern Time on a weeknight. The 2018 NWHL All-Star Game, which was streaming on Twitter, had 580,000 unique viewers. So this idea that no one cares is just not true. Professional women's hockey is still relatively new. It's only been around for a decade, with the CWHL as we know it in this permutation of professional women's hockey. So the audiences are growing. You're seeing more and more fans come out. And there's some data out there that suggests that the growth is really significant. You can look to USA Hockey keeps registration numbers available to the public. In the past year, the 2017-18 season, there was a 4.65% growth in women's registrations with USA in all ages compared to a 0.72% growth in men's registrations. That's almost 6.5 times more growth among women who are registering to play in the United States to play hockey. So clearly, plenty of people care. The second major myth is that there's no hitting in women's hockey, which is just not true. It's a simple phrase that dissuades a lot of fans from watching. For whatever reason, people think there's no hitting, so the game isn't as intense. To be clear, body checking, as in terms of finishing a check, following through with your arms, that is not allowed. But we see physical contact in every game. Every game I've ever been to, every game I've ever covered, every game I've ever watched, there's body contact, there are hits, there are body checks, many of which don't get called. But you can see from these two pictures on the slide, there's hitting in the professional game. On the left, that's Madison Packer laying out Jillian Dempsey near the Riveters net. And on the right is a hit in an international game between Canada and Finland. So there's tons of physicality in women's hockey. You need to be able to take the body to defend effectively, as you can see on the image on the right, which is courtesy of Michelle J. Players, you have to be able to rub players out along the boards. You have to be able to use your physicality to, stop the progress of attacking forwards. So to say there's no hitting is just, it's not true. But this idea that there's no body checking, the IIHF rule that is translated over to the CWHL and NWHL, raises a lot of questions. For instance, how does something like no body checking influence puck possession? How does it impact something like how many chances we see from Royal Road, which is the high scoring area in front of the net, and also known as the slot generally? And we don't really know the answers to these questions, which is a shame. But it feels like we have a lot to learn from comparing the men's and women's games, particularly with things like possession and things like the rule differences and how they impact the flow of the game and where scoring chances are generated. The final major myth or misconception is that they are not as skilled. And this is something that a lot of fans point out. People will say, I shouldn't say fans, a lot of naysayers will point out. A lot of people like to point out, like, Team Canada will prepare for the Olympics by playing high school teams and they'll lose. And, the NWHL teams will play against, the Buffalo Beauts will play against the Junior Sabres and they'll lose. There are biological realities at play here. Men are bigger, faster, and stronger than women just generally. But different is not lesser. These are still elite athletes in their sport. It's also really important to take note of the fact that women have had access to fewer resources than men in terms of hockey for a very long time. Title IX is not yet 50 years old. We've only seen, this generation of players did not grow up knowing that professional hockey was an option for them. We won't see that for another generation or two. And those are a lot of things to keep in mind for, when we compare these games and when we ask things like, where's the women's game compared to the men's game? The NHL has been around for over a century, just to put things into context. But to pretend that these athletes are not skilled is ridiculous. One anecdote, and although it's a gimmick, and it was at the NHL skills accuracy competition in last year's All-Star game, was Hillary Knight had a better time for the skills accuracy competition than Sidney Crosby did. So clearly there's a lot of skill with these women. They can shoot hard, they can skate fast, they can stick handle. It is a game that, it rewards skill, it rewards speed, just like the men's game. And the more talented players and more talented teams succeed. So there's plenty of skill on display. And someone who would know a lot about all the skill that's on display in women's hockey is Shannon Zabados. Shannon Zabados has a really unique perspective on the differences between the men's and women's game. She played professional hockey in the SPHL, which is the Southern Professional Hockey League for the Cottonmouths and Rivermen, which is a men's league. And recently she signed with the Buffalo Beauts for the upcoming season. She's also been a 3-time Olympian for Team Canada. Zabados recently had an interview when she signed with the Beauts and shared her thoughts on, what's different about the two games. And she said, and I quote, "I've played both sides, and they're different games. One isn't better than the other. It's a different type of game. The women's game is a lot of possession, and I hate to say it, but in the women's game, the players play the game smarter. Sometimes that means hanging on to the puck a little bit longer, or making a pass where sometimes a guy would shoot." End quote. And so even a player like Zabados, who has this really unique and valuable perspective on the difference between the two games. She's played both sports at, both the men's and women's game at an elite level. And even she's talking about we see more possession in the women's game. They're more patient with the puck, especially at the elite level. And it would be great if we could finally use data to investigate that claim or that theory and to look at where the women's game differs from the men's game, not just so we can learn more about the men's game, but so we could learn more about a sport that we really just don't understand in women's hockey. We don't have enough data. We don't have enough ways to investigate things like puck possession, to investigate, the game with analytics. But we're slowly getting there. And now kind of move on to the meat of my presentation. When we talk about analytics in women's hockey, we're primarily talking about the NWHL and CWHL. These are two leagues that Rob Vollman from Hockey Abstract, he released his preliminary translation factors, which is comparing the level of competition in major women's leagues, but he also included the World Championships and the Olympics. And he believes that the level of competition between the NWHL and CWHL is roughly equal. And that would make a lot of sense, just at face value. The NWHL is a proving ground in many ways for the Team USA, the national team players, whereas the CWHL traditionally has been the proving ground for Team Canada. There are a lot of similarities between the two leagues, but they do things a little bit differently, particularly when it comes to statistics. You can see here, this is a CWHL box score on the right and an NWHL box score on the left. And the first thing that should really jump out to you, other than the fact that they're different colors, is that the CWHL does not track shots. And that is something that is really, it's a very simple thing, a simple difference, and it's just one category of statistics, but shots help us tell a lot about individual player performance, and they help us evaluate players. Of course, shot attempts are even better, but just shots on goal, the fact that we don't have that in the CWHL is the reason why we're seeing most of the work being done with NWHL data, which I'll get to in a little bit. But the fact that the CWHL doesn't have the shots on goal makes comparing performance in these two leagues particularly difficult. We have things like plus minus, although they're not always accurate, and a lot of the statistics are not always kept up to date after each game. They change after a while, and unfortunately that's not the only problem that we have. There are a lot of obstacles when it comes to women's hockey analytics. The first being, really, there are a lot of problems similar to the early days of men's hockey. Teams are moving around a lot. In terms of this past season, we saw the NWHL gain a team, the CWHL lost a team. We also see things like player movement, which makes tracking trends in the development of players really tricky, especially when we're trying to get a better idea of the difference between these two professional leagues. Another really big thing is there's only the most basic stats available. We're talking goals, assists, points, plus minus, power play goals, shorthanded goals, points per game, etc., etc. So only having those most basic statistics really limits the stories we can tell and really limits how we can evaluate the players and try to get a better understanding of why a team is successful or struggling. Another major obstacle is the quality of the data. it kind of sucks. Both leagues use volunteers to track their statistics. Just as in a question of resources, they have to resort to that. And volunteers means that we have a lot of frequent errors. They're doing their best, and for the most part, they're doing very good work. But there are errors, and those errors are particularly frustrating because both leagues have incomplete video archives. And that makes more sophisticated stats like Corsi and things very difficult for us to track. But it also makes fact-checking the more basic statistics impossible. We just can't get to, certain games and have an understanding of why for a period maybe a team didn't register any shots. Was that a glitch, or was that something that, it just didn't happen? If there's no video evidence of it, you either have to be in the game or at the game or in the game. And it's very hard to track that data down. The NWHL, as I said before, has more stats, including some real-time stats like block shots and turnovers. So most of the work being done in women's hockey analytics right now is being done with NWHL data. And even with all these obstacles, there's still some really good work getting done. The first thing I wanted to turn our attention to is NWHL Game Score, which is created by Sean Ferris from hockeygraphs.com. Using a Dom L, I'm not going to attempt to pronounce his last name again, Dom L's formula, Sean came up with a game score for NWHL performance. There's no Corsi, there's no penalties drawn. We're working on that too. So he boiled down things really to, what happens for skaters in terms of goals and weighing everything against goals, just like Dom did. And this is a really valuable tool to us. It's our first kind of sophisticated tool that goes beyond just saying, this player had X amount of primary points in a season and had X amount of power play points. And having a game score, as you can see from the chart from some of Sean's work below, game score per game correlates really much. It's pretty much a direct correlation to points per game. And that's not surprising at all because everything is kind of weighted against goals, but it also helps tell us that we're doing something right in terms of how we evaluate skaters right now, which unfortunately is really by production, is the best way we can evaluate skaters, which makes evaluating defenders, particularly, those defenders who are less offensively inclined or skilled, really difficult. It also makes evaluating goaltenders particularly difficult, but I'll get to that in a second. Another kind of great breakthrough from the past year was Alyssa Longmuir made the NWHL two-player comparison tool using Sean's game score and also using the primary points that I tracked. And having this tool and breaking down players and their performance by percentiles was really exciting to have a tool like this. It's hard to describe if you don't follow along with the analytics community how exciting it is to just see something like this in Tableau for women's hockey. This was like kind of a eureka moment. It really helped motivate a lot of people to be like, oh, we can do stuff even with these simple numbers. And Alyssa's tool is particularly great because we can compare players and their performance across seasons. For instance, last season, the 2017-18 season, both the NWHL and CWHL, but of course this tool is just for the NWHL, the Olympians were out of the league in residency preparing for Pyeongchang. And so we saw, a lot of players who were kind of flew under the radar have big years, like Alexa Grushow and Jillian Dempsey for Boston. And being able to compare their seasons in 2018 to the season of, let's say, Brianna Decker in 2017 helps put things into context. And as we all know, context is really everything when it comes to statistics. We've also seen some visualizations with women's hockey data. Here's a visualization created by Shayna Goldman, who writes for The Athletic and Blue Shirt Banner and Hockey Graphs. And being able to present data this way, as opposed to just a table filled with numbers in Excel or Google Sheets, really helps, translate performance to readers and to viewers when we're trying to help tell the stories of what's happening. This particular table is the NWHL even strength scoring from last season. And you can see that the first two bars in the graph are Alexa Grushow and Jillian Dempsey, which goes to show just how great Jillian Dempsey was, although Grushow brought home the MVP last season. And I mentioned goaltending before, and we still have very simple statistics to work with goaltending, but that doesn't mean we're not getting useful and reliable data. Crease Giants on Twitter, at Crease Giants no underscore, has really kind of led the way and inspired me with their work. You can see from this chart, this is the performance of goaltenders in the CWHL 2017-18 season. You can see being able to track things like quality starts, really bad starts, scaling down because of the length of the season with goals saved above average per 30 shots. That's what GSAA/30 is. And having all of this really helps us understand and put into context the performance of goaltenders, especially when we marry it to the performance of teams and take a close look at things like how many power play goals a team has allowed. And that's what I ended up doing for the Olympics when I took a lot of what Crease Giants had done, and I wanted to do my best to cover what happened with the goaltenders at the Olympics and add some context with simple things like the power play goals allowed. You can see at Pyeongchang, Nadezhda Morozova from the Olympic athletes of Russia. She's about halfway down the table on this page. She had an .885 save percentage, which doesn't look too good. But when we include things like context, or I should say when we include context and consider things like the fact she was playing in Group A against Finland and USA and Canada, that save percentage becomes a little more, it looks a little less bad. And when we also consider the fact that she allowed 7 power play goals against, we can further kind of understand that, how much of that was really on her or some sort of deficit in her performance when her team was clearly taking a lot of penalties and she was allowing a lot of goals while she was shorthanded. So having things like, these simple, really simple goaltending stats, it's hard to look at things like evaluating performance on special teams for goalies. Obviously shorthanded is what we pay the most attention to. We don't have low danger save percentage or high, we don't have a lot of things, but we can still, with really simple data, get things like GSAA. We can help add context to these numbers, and it kind of goes to show how much we can do with very few tools available to us. And that was really, it ties well to what happened with Pyeongchang. It was something of a watershed moment for the women's hockey statistics community. Pyeongchang proved with more resources, there's more data. At Pyeongchang, we had time on ice per game, which is a huge deal in women's hockey. We also had the number of shifts per game, and we had things like shot maps and shot charts, and having all of that data was so exciting, and it really inspired us to see these things can happen in women's hockey. It's just a question of the resources catching up with our wish list, I suppose. Even with all that, though, there are a lot of issues with Olympic data, just like there's issues with the professional women's hockey data. The tournament format at the Olympic really skews all the numbers. It punishes the second-tier teams like Finland, like Russia, when in the preliminary stage, the group stage, they're competing against the two powerhouses in Canada and the USA. And so we look at something like, in this particular table, Marie-Philippe Poulin, who's almost certainly, one of the top 3 players in the world, if not the best player in the world. Having, 6 points in 5 games doesn't really jump off the page when Melody Daou had 7 points in 5 games for Canada. But we have to take into consideration that Canada, was playing against, the best teams in the world, and they played USA twice. And so we look at that compared to the performance of, let's say, Alina Mueller on Switzerland, who was a 19-year-old. She scored 4 goals in a game against Korea in the group stage, and comparing Mueller's stat line to Poulin's stat line doesn't tell us the whole story. So the more context we can add to these things, the more we learn. And the Olympics really sparked a lot of questions for us. It asked us, it encouraged us to ask, what else can we do with what we have? What do we really need? And, something else we took away from the Olympics is, you'll notice in the games played column here, the teams in the Olympics played either 5 or 6 games, is another issue I forgot to mention before. So we're dealing with really small sample sizes. And in the NWHL and CWHL, we're talking 16 or 28 game seasons. So, it's a fraction of what a lot of the analytics community is used to with the NHL and men's hockey. But back to what I was saying before, the Olympics raised a lot of questions for us. It also inspired us to challenge what more can we do with what we have. And it also reminded us of what do we really need to help tell the stories better. And the biggest takeaway perhaps from the Olympics is that time on ice is really the holy grail for women's hockey analytics right now. It's the thing that will help us really be able to evaluate defenders and to evaluate how valuable certain players are to their team and to get a better idea of what's happening when players are on the ice. And professional women's rosters roll with typically 3 lines of forwards and 3 lines of defenders. So it's not a full bench like we're used to in the NHL. And in the Olympics, they have even larger benches than what we see in the NHL. But from this chart, this visualization made by Shayna Goldman, you can see just how valuable someone like Jenny Hirokoski is to Team Finland. She's the best defender in the world by pretty much every measure. And at the Olympics, playing for Team Finland in that very difficult Group A, she was averaging over 28 minutes a night. So her points per game might not jump off the page, but her value to the team is tremendous. And that's something that we can look at time on ice at the Olympics and say, this is what we need when we evaluate professional women's hockey. It's really just a question of how do we get there. And that kind of brings me to wrapping things up and what I've learned from the past 3 years in particular, especially in the wake of Pyeongchang and in the wake of the 3rd season of looking at data from the NWHL and CWHL. The women's game has never been bigger, and working in this field provides a really unique opportunity to record history and to help tell these stories and to help, treat these elite professional athletes like the athletes they are, and to evaluate them, not just the human interest stories, not just the it's so great, they're growing the game, they're inspiring young girls. All those things are great, but we can still tell hockey stories. We can still evaluate players and treat them like pros. And furthermore, the real thing that I came away with this is the more work we do with analytics, the better understanding we'll gain a much better understanding of a sport that is so frequently misunderstood and underpublicized. We just don't know enough about women's hockey. And I think that's part of the reason why we see such poor representation of women in the Hockey Hall of Fame. When you look at a career like Hayley Wickenheiser from Team Canada, such an elite player. She played in 4 separate Olympics for Team Canada. Like I said before, there's 5 or 6 games in each Olympics, so we're talking 25 maybe games. And so you compare that to, there's also, of course, the World Championships and other international games, but it's very hard, I think, for people who are uneducated about women's hockey to look at a career like Wickenheiser's and compare it to a career of an NHL player who's played 1,000 games and has had 900 some odd points, 1,000 points, and trying to quantify a player's how valuable they are and how unique and potent they were during their career is really hard without the data. And the more work we have with this data, the bigger the database gets, the more statistics we can use to help tell these stories. We're going to learn a lot about women's hockey, and in doing so, we'll expand our knowledge of hockey as a whole. There's a lot we can learn about hockey in general and men's hockey by taking a closer look at the events in women's hockey, particularly things like puck possession, things like where scoring chances are generated, how body checking impacts the game, or I should say the lack of body checking impacts the game. We can help combat misconceptions like there's no hitting in women's hockey. We can actually do a lot of work to help translate the game and make it more appealing to fans when they can have a better idea of what's happening on the ice to help tell the stories better. And that's why I think this is such a worthwhile frontier. The work I've been doing the past 3 years is as frustrating as it's been, and with all the obstacles I've run into and all the times I've had to correct my work after the league changes things without letting, or the leagues change things without letting people know. At the end of the day, it's all worth it. I've learned a lot about women's hockey and hockey in general, and it wouldn't have been possible without the contributions of a lot of people. And that's what brings me to this final slide, which is a spotlight on the work of a lot of people who have helped move the chains forward in the world of women's hockey analytics. Not listed here is Carolyn Wilkie, who's also done tremendous work and kind of helped pave the way and inspire me to really take this up and to do what I can with analytics. So she should definitely be someone you follow at Classlicity on Twitter. You could follow her there. And Alyssa Longmuir, Sean Ferris, Rob Volman, Adam Gavriel does good work for NWHL.Zone, Crease Giants, and Shayna Goldman. There are more people who are doing work, but these are just some of the people who I used a lot of their data and talked about some of the things they've worked on in this presentation. Please follow them on Twitter. Take a close look at their work and what they're doing. A lot of them also do work with NHL data, if that's your cup of tea, so be sure to check that out. Thank you so much for listening, for taking the time to check this out.